Well, joining us in the studio now is Jessica Montel, Executive Director of the organization CISO, Save Israel, Stop the Occupation, and attorney Ron Bar-Yoshafat. He's an expert on public diplomacy. Jessica, to start with you, 50 years on, has that camp in Israel, which argues Israel must withdraw from the areas it took in 1967, have you lost the argument?
No, I mean, I think 50 years is really a wake-up call for anyone who cares about the Israeli democracy. I mean, this whole limbo that you talked about is predicated on the idea that it's temporary, that our hold over 2.5 million people who are not part of the Israeli democracy is a temporary situation. 50 years is starting to look like it's not temporary, and then that really pushes the envelope in terms of us having to decide in terms of our future. Are we going to continue to be a Jewish and democratic state, in which case we really cannot continue to rule over that population anymore?
Ron, what's your reaction to that?
Well, I strongly disagree with the facts, because ever since the Oslo Accords, almost all of the Arabs of Judea and Samaria are under the Palestinian Authority. So I don't see them as something that's really under our military constraints. Furthermore, I think that to get out of Judea and Samaria would be a national suicide. So I think it's almost impossible to think of something like that.
In the alternative, what is the alternative for Israel? Because when there are those facts on the ground, we've been speaking about it a couple of times tonight, what is the alternative for Israel with the Palestinians in the West Bank and with a growing settler movement in the West Bank?
Well, I would argue the alternative is to implement the Israeli law in Judea and Samaria. That would be, I think, the best solution for this case. Because I don't think that the obstacle for peace is the less than 5% of Jews living in Judea and Samaria. And I think if people want to promote what is, I see not really in the near foreseeable future, peace agreement, you should put more pressure on the PA to stop the incitement for terror and not talk about where Jews should and should not live.
Jessica, I want you to have a chance to respond.
Yes, you say we should apply Israeli law to Judea and Samaria, to the West Bank, and all residents of those territories should be entitled to full rights of the Israeli democracy. Yes,
I do, and I feel what you're really concerned about is the demographics, and I strongly recommend to encourage Jews making aliyah into Israel, making them more accessible to come to Israel, lower regulation, and by all means have more Jewish babies. I would argue that all of the demographic experts in Israel would argue that Jews are having more babies and the Arab birth rate is declining.
Well, it's clearly difficult to imagine 2.5 million, you can argue, plus or minus, 2.5 million Palestinian Arabs being absorbed into the Israeli democracy, that Israel would retain its Jewish character. From the democratic perspective, if you're seriously proposing full and equal rights to all residents of those territories, then it seems clear that democratic values then, in your mind, trump Israel's Jewish identity.
Well, I strongly disagree, and I think what we're talking about is not a tiny difference in how many Arabs live in Judea. You're saying 2.5. I think it's 1.5. It's really hard to say because they never really had a full census count under the PA. But again, if that is the main concern, why lower the territory instead of increasing the people? When Israel was created in 1948, we didn't have a better
Ron, either way, though, we're talking about a binational state. If you're talking about no two-state solution, if you're talking about essentially annexing the West Bank along with all the Palestinians living in it, how can you have a Jewish state and a binational state that includes everybody?
So first of all, I'm not annexing, I'm implementing the Israeli law because I didn't take it from...
What's the difference?
Annexing meaning it wasn't ours. And I think that we're actually talking about two different discussions here. One is what is best for Israel's interest to maintain a Jewish and democratic state, and the other is the question of the wrongdoing of Israel, by Israel to the Arabs of Judea. So I think I do have the moral high grounds. If you're talking about Israel's interest, I'm saying if what you're concerned about is demographics, then worry about demographics. I'm just saying I don't think we're going to be a binational state. You can add up the numbers. You're saying 2.5 still, I have a Jewish majority. I say it's 1.5, and also I'm saying then that should be the main cause, helping demographics. But
Jessica, in that case, what happens 10 years down the line in that scenario?
Well, first of all, there is no movement inside Israel, no political parties, no politicians calling for full and equal rights of all of the Arabs living in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, precisely because those people for whom it's important to maintain those territories are not committed to equal rights are focusing specifically on, having your cake and eating it too. That on the one hand, of course, they want to maintain Israel's identity as a Jewish state, and also maintaining those territories, holding people in this legal
Jessica,
limbo.
how do you answer Israelis who might agree with everything you just said, but say the security risk is just too great now to end the occupation?
Well, then what I would say is that in the meanwhile, they need to be giving full rights to those people. I mean, on that, I would join you. If Israel really says there's no partner, and I think it's very convenient for Israel, and we have seen the move in terms of the broader region. I mean, the longer, I'll put it this way, time is not on our side. If you think that the situation is difficult and challenging now, I guarantee you that 10 years from now or 20 years from now, those same people who say that today we do not have a partner will be looking back nostalgically at the potential that we had now for a diplomatic agreement. If in the meantime you cannot continue to be holding people without basic rights, everyone under Israeli control, that's 2.5 million Palestinians, have to be granted full rights. It's ludicrous to say that those people are living under Palestinian sovereignty.
Let's
the
pause
Israeli
on that
military
note.
controls those populations.
We'll pause on that note for a moment, but the conversation continues. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back to I-24 News. I'm Nareep Ben, continuing the conversation here 50 years after the Six-Day War, and a heated debate here about one of the key issues, really, Israeli democracy, the future of that, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But we'll pause for a moment to go to New York.
Well, that argument, of course, Nareep, still is raging also abroad, especially in the United States and the American Jewish community. Let's go now to Rabbi Joshua Weinberg, president of the Association of Reform Zionists of America. Josh, I want to ask you, the Six-Day War was also a turning point of sorts for American Jewry, wasn't it?
Absolutely, Kalev. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you so much. There was no doubt that it was a massive turning point for all those who were watching from the United States and from North America and from around the world, I have to imagine, in that, as we all are aware, just in the days and weeks prior to the war, everyone was worried to the point of preparing for a possible next Holocaust or to suffer great losses. And the dramatic victory that took place in such a short time gave a tremendous surge of pride and support for diaspora Jews abroad. And many, of course, chose to come and join in the fate of the Jewish people after this dramatic victory.
But Josh, that war, of course, divided opinion here in Israel. We're having a debate now in our studio. But it's also divided, for example, American Jewry. What is the role of American Jewry in this argument over the legacy of the Six-Day War, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria?
Well, of course, that debate is raging in Israel as it well is here in North America and the United States, where it is really the central contentious question of the whole discussion on Israel. And I think that the American Jews play a very important role. And I think if we want to see Israel as the Jewish state, and we want to see Israel representing Jewish people around the world, then what Israel does affects the rest of us, and we are very concerned, and those of us especially who consider ourselves to be Zionists want to make sure that Israel is a both Jewish and democratic state that we can be proud of. And when we see Israel going down this path of 50 years of a situation that was meant to be temporary and is no longer seeming so temporary, it was great reason for concern and great reason for many of us to try and be involved as much as we can.
And Josh, how do you answer those Israelis who say you want to be involved in the debate, but American Jews won't suffer the consequences if they're wrong about the cost in which to take?
There is no doubt that there's a difference in terms of the terms and the context of the debate. Those who live in Israel have a completely different viewpoint and frame of reference for how they see it. That doesn't mean that American Jews should be discounted, though. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a financial piece. I often discuss very bluntly with many of my Israeli friends who I served in the army with in Israel as well, who say, you in America keep writing checks but don't have an opinion. That's just one aspect of it. I want to go back and say that we want to be able to be proud of Israel and to support Israel and to see that Israel is really a light, first of all, unto itself, and then into the nations. And I think that we have an important role to play. I think the old model of Israel in the center and everyone else looking in is time to be reformed a bit, and that we can start to change what it looks like. I think it's much more of a two-way discussion about the future of the Jewish people en masse, worldwide. And we have this opportunity now, 50 years later, to be having those very, very real discussions.
Rabbi Joshua Weinberg, thanks for joining us.
Still with us here in the studio, Jessica Montel, Executive Director of the organization Save Israel, Stop the Occupation, along with attorney Ran Bar-Yoshafat. Ran, I want to ask you, right after the Six-Day War, the sort of conversation of land for peace really began in Israel for the first time on a new level. Today, from what you've said before, does that conversation still exist? What happened to that equation?
Well, it didn't begin in that time. Actually, the PLO was created in 1964 with one goal, and that goal was to destroy the state of Israel. And that time, Jordan had illegally occupied Judea and Samaria. The concept of land for peace...
Certainly the PLO was awakened at that time on an entirely new level, post-67.
The PLO was created when Israel did not have any control of Judea and Samaria. The PA, when it was offered in the Oslo Accords, it was only created in 1994. No one has actually talked about a two-state solution, including Yitzhak Rabin. He talked about autonomy, and that was his fear was demographic, so he wanted to give them autonomy. The talk about a two-state solution seems like it happened for 60 years. The PA exists from 1994. We definitely are not occupying them. But I think there's one point that we're missing out, and the fact is there really suffering of the Arabs in Judea and Samaria? And I'm going to argue that since the dawn of history, there has never been so much prosperity for the Arabs in Judea and Samaria. In fact, the reason why the PA is in control is thanks to Israel. Because if Israel will not help them, Hamas or ISIS will take over and they will butcher each other. I don't see how that is any better.
We certainly heard a very clear answer to that from Dr. Bassem Khoury earlier in Ramallah. The answer was yes, there is suffering and they do want an end to the occupation. Jessica, what is your response to that?
Well, it's irrelevant to say things were worse 10,000 years ago or things are worse in Syria. The fact is, 50 years they've been held by the Israeli military, denied political rights and a whole slew of other rights. Obviously, they are demanding those rights, and they have a basic, basic human rights that they are entitled to. And I would also say, from the perspective of the Israeli democracy, that it's in our interest not to continue military rule over a population that doesn't want to be ruled by us.
But I want to ask you to respond to that in the sense of she's making the point that the situation is simply not, your scenario is not a viable one.
Well, I disagree, and I want to share a thought. Never has ever a liberation movement refused a deal. And they were offered more than 90% of Judea and Samaria. So what would have made this deal close? 99%, 99.2%? If there isn't a case where someone wants to have a liberation movement and doesn't accept any offer. So I'm saying that we don't really have a partner. You can say it as much as you want that it's our fault. At the end of the day, we don't have any other option.
Ran Bar-Yoshafat, Jessica Montel, thanks very much for weighing in. This is clearly a debate that is a very important one and just a testament to just how relevant that Six-Day War 50 years ago is today in 2017. We'll be right back. Don't go anywhere.